Welcome to Live from the Table, the official podcast of the world-famous Comedy Cellar. I'm Periel, the producer of the show. I'm here with Noam Dworman, the owner of the Comedy Cellar.
Yep.
And we have a very special guest, recurring guest, Nick Gillespie, editor-at-large at Reason, the Libertarian magazine of free minds and free markets.
I like being recurring. It's I feel like herpes.
We like you a little bit more than we like herpes.
Well, we all have herpes, though, right? This is
Dormant.
like if you had chickenpox or something,
Right.
Herpes,
Or
The
if you got
herpes
a lot of
virus.
Herpes
unprotected-
zoster, yeah.
and unprotected sex, of course. But
Never. I've never. And he is also the host of The Reason interview with Nick Gillespie.
thank you.
Well, welcome to our show.
I will, if I can, just start off out of the gate plugging my own show. I just released a great episode. It comes out on Wednesday, so whenever this comes out, but with the novelists Lee Stein and Julius Taranto talking about whether or not we can do satire anymore in America. Not because we're not allowed to, but because things are just so fucking crazy. Like if there's
Truth is stranger than satire.
yeah, and there's a famous essay by Philip Roth in Commentary in 1961 where he's like, he was talking about like Charles Van Doren, the Columbia professor who cheated on the game show 21.
Yeah.
That got made into the movie quiz show and stuff. And he's like, you just can't keep up with this kind of crazy reality. And it's like Philip Roth, you had no idea what America was going to look like, 60 years later.
Periel is blushing because she almost slept with Philip Roth.
Oh, really? What happened?
It's a long story. You can read about it. I don't want to take up the
Oh.
episode, but it's a chapter in my last book. You can
Oh,
read,
really?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. The woman who wrote Asymmetry got like a National Book Award out of sleeping with Philip Roth.
Well, I was trying to get a National Book Award by sleeping with him, but it didn't quite work out that way.
How could you not? It's when he found out you were Jewish. He's like, okay, I'm out.
Yeah, he had no idea she was Jewish.
He went back to pounding liver.
I think it was actually when she started talking.
That's not true.
Yeah.
Some people actually enjoy my company to talk to me.
So when you sat down, you
Yeah.
told me we were just like chatting about the local New York elections.
Yeah.
Anthony Weiner is running to be
Yeah,
my local city
member.
council.
He's
Yeah.
not yours, isn't
Yes.
it the East Village? Or
The district runs all the way here.
Yeah, I was on Mike Pesca's podcast with him, and I hate to sound like we're in the old Tonight Show or something, some crappy Hollywood circle jerk, but Weiner, you know what? I think Weiner is pretty sociopathic, which is not necessarily bad in a politician. But when I was on, like the first thing he did out of the gate, it was like, you knucklehead. Like he was, negging me. And Anthony Weiner is a kind of pure, gain of function version of a New Yorker, where even if you agree with him, he just has to attack you. And, he
Gain of function for
he's a horrible, has a horrible personal manner, and I think he's probably won his last election.
Did you think that before you met him in person?
You know what? I had followed him on TV back when he was a congressman, and all the Breitbart stuff and all of that stuff was coming out. And I had always he had always struck me on gab shows, and I think he would go on Fox as well as like CNN or MSNBC. And what I liked about him is that he was willing to argue with people, which is good, you know. And he has a definite point of view, and he's not. He's not a super identity politics progressive.
No, he's not.
Which is good. But he is a noxious kind of human being, I think. And he raises a lot of interesting questions. In the context of the show, we were talking, he brought up the fact that in the New York mayor's race, there's at least three of the candidates, Scott Stringer, Eric Adams, and Andrew Cuomo, all have, either have sexual assault charges or impropriety charges against them that were either, taken seriously or not. And he pointed out, which is a kind of clever move, that he paid his time, literally.
He did hard time, by the way. So,
Yeah.
so just, I've met Anthony Weiner. I didn't know him until, 6 months ago.
When you picked up your daughter's cell phone, and you were like,
No.
When he contacted me because he's running for office here, and I met with him,
Yeah.
and I rather liked him. I mean, this kind of a pugnacious personality that you're describing. I enjoyed that.
I likened him in a post somewhere after this event. He's like the burp that you have after eating a dishwater dog on the sidewalk.
Oh my God, you're harsh.
Yeah. No, well, I mean that's just who he is, and he doesn't hold up. What's interesting, and because I would love to talk about the New York City mayor's race a little bit, but in New York. Ideology should be less important. The more local the race, right? And one of the things that's frustrating about somebody like Weiner, who recognizes that the Democrats, have fallen out of favor, and that may only be for a couple more months, really, until the midterms, and the Republicans nationally are doing everything they can to lose whatever advantages they have. But when he'll be like, yeah, we have to fix things, we have to change things, and then it's like, okay, well, what should we do about Social Security? Absolutely nothing. Medicare, nothing. Everything is, we shouldn't do anything other than tax rich people more and give more stuff to more people. And to me, that is unbelievably frustrating to be in those conversations where we went from, in 2019, at the federal level, spending $4.4 trillion to now we're going to spend $7.2 trillion this year under a conservative Republican who's doging the government and stuff like that. And there's just something fucked up. If you can't figure out how do you get back close, if not below $4.4 trillion, which at the time was a record amount of money that was being spent.
So let me just say, it's not my place to tell a guest what they, shouldn't say about even people that I have friendships with. I'm not a good friend of Anthony Weiner, but we know each other. And, the things that he got in trouble for are quite serious. Mm-hmm. And I told him that on the show here. Yeah. And, I've had to process it, but he did his time. He did hard time, not minimum security time. He did 2 years, and then afterward worked like a job that was only for like ex-cons. And he's been very forthright about it. And I do. One part of me says, yes, people have done their time. That should be the end of it. Another part of me can't be dishonest, and we know that certain crimes, which are based on kind of personal pathologies, are not just they can recur, but he said he goes for regular counseling, and he called himself an addict. And to the extent that however you'd want somebody like him to behave, I think he's doing that. And so I
agree with that. Yeah. And he spoke on this show about being in recovery and whatnot, and he seems to take it seriously.
Yeah, he does take it seriously.
And by the way, one thing you were talking about, like, we assume that sex crimes are categorically different than other crimes. There is actually very little criminological or sociological data that actually backs that up. It's considered true, but people like Thomas Szasz, the great psychiatrist, who was a critic of psychiatry and the medicalization of everyday life, he was a longtime contributing editor to Reason, wrote a lot about that, as did others. And it turns out that that's actually not true, which should be a relief to people. And none of this means you don't prosecute sex crimes, rapidly and effectively and all of that. But if he's in if he's taking recovery seriously and all of that, there's no reason to worry about him with that. I mean, the harder questions come, like what do you do in New York City? What are the pressing issues, and how do you fix them? Because we have an insane amount of political gridlock in this city, that I call home, that I was born in, and then I lived in and worked in, and then moved away from and came back to, and it's frustrating. And when you look at the mayor's race, it's just kind of like, holy cow, this is not good.
So Weiner, comes across. It's like in this atmosphere, he comes across as a right of center New York candidate. And, as a business owner, I want to support the most right-wing local candidate that there is.
When you say right-wing, you mean somebody who's pro-business? Or is
somebody who's pro-business, yeah.
Not the most right-wing.
Well, maybe not most right wing on a national election, but I'm talking in terms of what's realistic in a New York City election.
Yeah.
to be in the running, he is the most right-wing guy we're going to get.
Is he going to win? Does he? I have no idea.
I don't think there's any really credible polling,
Yeah.
but he's out there apparently every day shaking hands, whatever it is. People are forgiving.
Yeah.
I've spoken to people, and I spoke to Tiana over here, and just people, waitresses who work for me and stuff like that, and they were like, yeah, I could vote for a guy, even though they knew what happened, which was interesting to me.
Yeah.
And so maybe he will win. Name recognition in a local election is very, very important. And he is a winning. People like him. They do.
Yeah,
like
I'm
him.
not sure of that.
Nick doesn't.
Yeah, well, you know why? Because that kind of in your face, like right out of the box, he's like somebody's electrocuting him, and he's in your face. I don't know if people like that. I mean, I don't like it particularly, and I think I have a thicker skin than a lot of people. But, ultimately what it comes down to is like, okay, what are you going to do about the rats and the garbage, and how are you going to make it easier for more? This gets complicated very quickly, especially in a place that's like the west, Greenwich Village or East Village or whatever. When you say, how do we make it easier for people to live here? How do we make rents cheaper? And then people are like pissed off because I don't want anybody else living here.
Yeah.
It's. I just came back from a trip to Austin, Texas, where Reason Magazine, where I work, had an annual donor event. We have them in different cities every year, and this time it was in Austin. And before that, with a couple of colleagues, we were doing a documentary about how Austin has had massive growth, really over the past 50 years. But since COVID, like a lot of people, when the lockdown started, they moved to Austin, rents went up, and then miracle of miracles, the city council and Texas at the state level, and there's county, government, they all were like, okay, we're going to make it easier for developers to build housing. And rents now are lower than they were at right after COVID, when people started pouring into the city. And it was amazing. Like, you can imagine this. It's like New Yorkers. When you go to people in a city and you're saying like, what's the secret here? Rents are going down. And it's like, well, Nick, it's like this. And this is left-wingers and right-wingers and libertarians and, left-wing anarchists, and homeless people. Everybody there seems to be on amphetamines. The homeless people are really, in New York, they're kind of low-key in fentanyl, and in Texas they are just really, on a lot of uppers. But every one of them just said, Nick, here's, this, sit down because this is kind of complicated, but it's like, if there's more demand for housing and then you build more housing, the prices go down. And I was like, wow, it is amazing that like no other city, seriously, like no other big city has thought of that.
So what do you make of this whole new Ezra Klein movement to that like it's like they discovered the most elementary rules.
Well,
Eureka.
It is, I part of me is like, I love this stuff, and I loved it, even more when I read it in Reason 50 years ago, or 25 years ago, or 20 years ago. But more, just without any reservations or anything, I think it is great to see people who identify as progressive saying, what we're talking about here constantly are problems in supply rather than demand. And to say, instead of being like, oh, well, what we got to do is, like, we have to make it so people, people don't want as much health care. People don't want as much housing. People don't want as much education because it's too expensive. Mm-hmm. And instead of focusing on those old things and trying to distribute things through the government, they're saying, okay, we need to think about supply. How do you maximize and maximalize supply of everything? I think that's great. I like, that they're focused on this and that they're talking about this. I'm uncomfortable. Their solutions tend to be too top down for me and too technocratic. Like it's just that the government is going to be very involved with saying, okay, you can build this, but not this. And, these people get first crack. It's just things like that. I mean, we need to become Promethean. Again, I think, we need to be stealing fire from the gods. And within politics and outside of politics, like we just need to become less governable, and let things go. I mean, in Austin,
I agree with you. I just said that to Corinne in the last hour. I said it used to be the Wild West, and it was good.
Yeah, I mean, and it's rules.
I didn't say
there.
Promethean, but it was same idea.
Okay, no, actually, Wild West is better, right? Like, who am I trying to impress? Yeah, we need one of the things that's fascinating in Austin is that there's the city of Austin, and then it's within Travis County, and there's a bunch of other counties around there. But in most of these places, in unincorporated areas, you can basically do whatever you want. And so, like, there's a big chunk of land, and a developer can go, and as long as they get certain basic permits and they build the infrastructure, the roads going in and out, and the sewers and the water and all of that, like, they can do what they want. And God, that's like kind of amazing. And in Texas, I've been thinking about this a lot because I lived in Texas in the 90s. I lived in the prison town in Texas, Huntsville, where the death chamber is. And it was, a weird.
Gary
experience.
Gilmore was.
No, he was out in Utah. I
Utah,
think.
right?
Yeah, he might have killed people in Texas because
I think I confused
he was a very good driver, and I loved those those kind of serial killers who read on the road because like Ted Bundy, he was in like Florida and Washington State. It's like they really put a lot of miles on, but. In Texas, unlike places like California where I've lived and Florida where I've visited a fair amount, and I guess Florida is a different story, or New York where I live, like in Texas, they're like, you know what, we got a lot of land. And like the buildings can never reach up to blot out the sun. So it's like, let's just start building more, bigger, higher, taller. And that's kind of exciting. I mean, I'm a second generation born in America, or third generation, second generation, whatever that is. And like the whole reason, I kept hearing about why people came here was because you could build stuff that you couldn't do in like old Europe, and in New York, I mean, the way my parents talked about New York in the, 30s, 40s, 50s, especially, you could really, take big swings and like build stuff out and just do what you wanted. And if you couldn't do it in New York, then you would go west and do it. And, California is, it's an unbelievable state where it's like you can't really do anything. I was just reading a story today, the Pacific Palisades fires, and the mayor, Karen Bass, who is ridiculous, and Gavin Newsom, they both were like, okay, what we're going to do now that this whole part of Southern California burned down, we're going to suspend all of the normal bullshit that we require. Since then, they've only approved 4 permits in Pacific Palisades for houses. And it's like, okay, well, you're done. People are going to move to Texas, where in the time, they leave L.A. and drive to Austin, like there'll be a complex, that has like 50 apartments in it or something.
Yeah, they talk about reforming things, and there is part of this. It is when Elon Musk has that chainsaw.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan at all. I know you're not either. And I want to talk about how the Trump administration has been behaving itself.
Yeah.
But yeah, the chainsaw is not a bad metaphor. It's not a bad image for what needs to be done.
And he kind of got that from Javier Milei, the Argentine president,
who you're a fan of.
Yeah, I like a lot so far. I mean, I have to admit I don't fully understand the intricacies of Argentine politics.
You don't?
No, I know. I've been faking it all these years. But he came around with a chainsaw, and I think in the past. People like Rand Paul might have shot. Did he use a chainsaw or like a wood chipper?
I don't know.
Or he might have shot, like regulations, like a stack of regulations, things like that. But yeah, I mean, part of it is you can spend your whole life trying to fix things in the place you are, or you can like light out for the territory and build on a kind of blank landscape. And I don't know.
Do you think that Ezra Klein and all these Democrats and liberals who have found this new religion, do you think that would have happened if Trump hadn't won?
Yeah, I do. In this sense that Klein and his co-author Derek Thompson of The Atlantic had been working on this kind of material, along with somebody like Matt Iglesias, who I believe actually grew up in the Village. They have. They've been working towards these ideas for a while. So that's good. And I mean, to me, in a lot of ways, I mean, I'm a hardcore libertarian. Reasons, we're the magazine of free minds and free markets. We like civil liberties and economic liberties and think they're all together. They're all part of the same thing. And so, we like the idea of just, if you can dream it, you can do it, as long as you're not, objectively hurting somebody else or stealing from them. within very large parameters. And I think it's good to see people that identify as being either liberal or leftist starting to come to those conclusions. The guy who is now the president of The Nation, one of the oldest magazines in the country and a very left-wing magazine, Bhaskar Sankara, he founded Jacobin, a socialist magazine, and he's an ideological character, but he even calls himself a market socialist. So, what he wants is a society that is fairer and more kind of egalitarian. But even he will say, in most cases, the way you get there is through markets and making sure people can participate in them.
So tell our, since it's related to this, tell our audience who doesn't understand it, because it is complicated, why are tariffs such a bad idea?
Yeah.
I'm presuming you think they're bad.
Yeah, I do.
The worst.
Yeah. I don't know if they're the worst, but
No redeeming.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. There's really no social or cultural or scientific redeeming value. What is the for porn, where it's like the test for porn if a work of art has no. No, it has like no artistic or social cultural meaning.
It only appeals to prurient interests.
Yeah, I mean, tariffs, the thing to understand about tariffs is that they are a tax that is, that is not levied on the producer, the exporter, the guy in China who's sending stuff here. It is a tax that is levied on the importer of that, which then ends up being passed on to the consumer. So it raises our prices.
Now, let me just stop you there, because now, does 100% of that price get passed along, or does the guy in China lower his prices?
Sometimes. It all varies, right? And it varies on a lot of things, but it's definitely an increase. Mm-hmm. And, because somebody's got to eat that somewhere. And it might be, sometimes the guy in China will will come up with a better way to produce stuff, so he can, he's got a fatter profit margin that the tariff eats into, because he's got to lower his price to get it in, so it costs less in America. Sometimes it's the importer will eat some of the costs, but ultimately it ends up increasing prices, and those are mostly borne by the consumer.
I mean, and you could imagine.
Okay, and then I was just going to say that it has the effect, the intended effect is that if tariffs are high enough and people know they're high enough and they're going to be around for a while, then the argument is that, well, we'll start producing these things that we were going to import because it's cheaper. That is not nearly often the case. And it's also partly because tariffs, people figure out ways to get around them, or they substitute products and goods and things like that. And one of the other bad things, and then I'm sorry for cutting you off, one of the other bad things that happens is if you're in a protectionist marketplace, you, as a producer, you tend not to be as competitive, because that the government, or that nobody can compete with you, so you have less competition. The classic case of this was the
auto industry in the 70s.
Yeah, I was going to say the big three or big 2.5 auto manufacturers, where there were heavy tariffs on imported cars, both high end and low end, and this stuff never really affects the high end, because people who are buying high end products can pay more if they want. But it wasn't simply that the U.S. auto companies were caught by surprise when tariffs started to decline, but it was also that they had baked into their production processes and their design processes and their labor contracts just so much inefficiency, because they didn't have to work that hard for sales.
Yeah, I remember my father, when he first got a Toyota, it was a revelation to him. He was like, I can't believe it. Like, if this is an American car, the window thing, the window regulator would be falling off by now, and the armrest would be falling off. And he says, look, the door is closed properly. He couldn't believe that you could make a car like this. Yeah. And then sure enough, the American cars got much, much better.
Oh, yeah. And also, the other thing is worth thinking about is what is an American car? Because a lot of it is, part of it is built overseas or in Canada or Mexico.
But here's my question. Yeah. I could imagine that the delta, as they say, between producing an identical product in China and America, where wages are so much lower, everything is just cheaper. It could be profoundly different. It could cost them 30% of what it costs an American company to make.
Think about like with avocados in Mexico. They're so cheap. It's cheaper to like import avocados from Mexico and ship them to New York than to grow them in Florida or California.
Right. So wait. So it's much cheaper in China, and then I don't really know if China has a free market such that there's competition between two companies in China making that item, so then they can raise the price, just a little bit below what the American guy can make it at, and we have our unions and all like that, and then they make a killing. The Chinese company makes a killing. Actually, it's not all passed on. Some small or some percentage of it is passed on to the American consumer, but a huge part of it is going in the pocket of a Chinese businessman.
Yeah.
And I think I know the answer to this, but I'm asking it also because this is how people are trying to understand this question. And what is wrong with us saying, well, you know what? We're going to take a chunk of that money.
Who's we?
The American government. We're going to get revenue from that.
Yeah, and then what are they going to do with that revenue? I mean, so it if you're a consumer, I don't
service the deficit.
That they're increasing because we're spending $7.2 trillion instead of $4.4 trillion or $2 trillion or whatever.
But is there something to that?
I mean, the idea is that you will raise, and I'm trying to remember now what the estimates are on this round of, of goods. Like, say it's, hundreds of billions of dollars a year. That one, it may not end up being that much. Oftentimes, these things the estimates are overly generous. Every time somebody says, I'm raising a tax or I'm cutting a tax, it's going to, they always oversell it. For whatever reason. But then, the idea that the U.S. government knows better what to do with money that they take from American consumers.
I agree with you on that.
That's tough. And the idea was we're going to use tariffs to pay for the tax cuts, the extension of the Trump and Republican tax cuts that got passed in 2017 or 18. And, that remains to be seen because, like, you just don't. You could tariff everything, and you're not going to get enough money to make up for the costs of those other tax cuts. And I like tax cuts. I think we pay too much in taxes, and we spend too much. But I also think that we need to pay for the government that we're actually having. And this is one of the things that happened. Really, it started in its modern form under George W. Bush, who inherited a balanced budget. And it was a balanced budget that had been balanced by Bill Clinton and a Republican Congress. And then they blew out everything by just borrowing wildly. That continued under Obama. It continued under Trump 1.0. It contributed. It continued under Bush or Biden rather, and it's probably going to continue under Trump. In a second term. So it's not like we're taking any of this new revenue and actually using it to retire the debt or to cut, really cut taxes in a way that is sustainable.
Have you thought about if you were emperor and you could reshape the budget as you wish and without causing any more hardship than you wish to cause, whatever health care you want to give, whatever Social Security you want to give, how much smaller you think you could make the budget?
Yeah, I mean, this is me kind of already giving up. But to say, you know what, maybe we should be able to go back to the 2019 level. That's before COVID, right? So, okay, and we all know.
Why not 1992 level?
Yeah, no. Well,
control
I'm
for inflation.
Say, I'm just saying as an easy thing to say, like, it shouldn't be that hard to go from, back to $4.4 trillion as a starting point and then cutting, or stopping growth and have us grow. If we grow the economy, whatever we're spending as government is less. For me, the big things and, the big drivers of spending at this point, and something like 75% of the budget, I started writing about federal budget issues in the early 2000s, and this is already boring me, so I apologize.
No, it's
for this,
to me.
But it's
she
back
just doesn't
then
understand it. That's what
you would talk about. Well, she's thinking about Philip Roth,
Yes.
who, and I want to get back to that. But you would always say something like, the federal government is made, has two parts to it. It's called discretionary spending and mandatory spending, each of which takes up about 50% of the budget. That's like what you would say circa 2002. Now, and that means mandatory spending is stuff that doesn't have to get re-upped every year. So that's like Social Security and Medicare.
And it's indexed to inflation often.
Yeah, in various ways. But like that is on autopilot. And then discretionary spending is stuff like defense and education, which technically has to get renewed every year. And Congress actually has to fucking do something, which they never do. And they didn't this year. Now it's 3/4 mandatory spending, and it's a quarter discretionary spending. So it's like, because Social Security, Medicare in particular, which the old age entitlements, they keep growing even as the amount of money that is taxed to fund them just doesn't keep pace. So for me, that would be like the primary, if I'm emperor, and you would have to be emperor because anybody who does this is probably going to get voted out of office pretty quickly, but we have to tackle that. And, Noam, you and I are of a certain age where we're nearing, the official retirement ages. And, it's wrong for people like us who have the means and the money and the ability to pay for our retirements and to pay for our health care to make somebody's grandkids, younger and poorer people pay for that on the idea that, when you retire, in 50 years, it'll be there for you. Because it won't be. I mean, it just can't.
Right.
We have too many people retiring with too few contributors. And it's a shitty deal. Like Social Security is, it's not just that it picks the pocket of younger workers to pay for older workers. It is a bad kind of guaranteed retirement plan. You would be much better off saving that money and putting it in, a mutual fund and just letting it ride for 30 years.
That's what Bush wanted to do. But,
kind of. Some of he screwed that up. It's a real shame. I mean, George W. Bush, it's hard to remember how unpopular he was and kind of how bad he was at everything other than blundering into really shitty wars. And it's worth remembering that because he seems kind of like a nice guy now, as does Obama, who also made a lot of really bad mistakes. Whereas Trump and Biden and Hillary Clinton, like they're more villainous, right? But Bush, when he won re-election in 2004, by really amping up the idea that we were about to be destroyed by Islamic terrorism and all of that, he said, I'm going to, I have a lot of political capital and I'm going to use it to fix immigration and Social Security. And he had decent plans for the beginning of that, but he was just not the guy to do it.
Now, what are the odds that, I'm looking at these flat screen TVs. I remember when they first came out, they were like $10,000, $12,000. Now they're almost a couple $100, right?
Yeah, that's probably, it's a Vizio, so you could get that at Walmart. That's probably like $200.
Yeah. So what are the odds that when all these pressures finally come to the breaking point, that technology will so decrease the costs of various things like healthcare, maybe housing will come down because we build more housing, that we'll have a much softer landing than you would imagine if everything was straight line projections based on what we have now.
No, I kind of believe in the singularity, the idea that eventually machines and computers will start talking, to each other. And I like AI. I mean, I think we have the
replace 20% of the workforce, the federal workforce now with AI, by the way.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, none of these things, you don't want doctors deciding like, okay, I'm checking the AI and it's said, okay, I'm going to cut off this leg, or whatever, or I'm going to deport these people because in an autocomplete field, it's like the name Dwarman came up, like you're MS-13, obviously. I can see he wears those long sleeves to hide the tattoos.
I'm MS-18.
Yeah.
It's a Jewish joke. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I don't believe in apocalypse. Like, things are never as bad as they seem. I remember after 9/11 and everybody was talking about dirty bombs, and it's like somebody could walk into Times Square.
I was worried about
with a valise, as they used to call them, and in a suitcase-sized bomb and detonated and then when you read what people said, okay, this is actually what would happen, you would have to, like, if you were exposed to it, go inside, take a shower, and keep your blinds closed, because the amount of radiation that even a dirty bomb would give off was like, it's
take
like getting a
iodine,
sun.
you're buying
I
iodine.
mean, it was like, God, this is kind of amazing. And when you look at this century, we've had so many terrible things thrown at us, including, COVID and the financial crisis and 9/11. And it's like we're doing pretty well, actually, in a lot of ways. So I don't believe in apocalypse, but it is true that the government is a primary cause of volatility and uncertainty in the economy and in our everyday lives. And like, it behooves us really to figure out, how are we going to address entitlement issues? How are we going to make it easier for people to get housing, whether they're renting or owning? And how do we unleash market forces that have made this TV super great and cheap? How do we bring that to healthcare and education and every other thing that we care about?
And of course, government keeps the prices high through all their.
Yeah.
So Trump, I want to get your take on.
Do you know what I said about Anthony Weiner?
Yeah.
As a New Yorker, as a gain of function New Yorker, so is Donald Trump,
Yes.
right? He's a cartoon version.
I think he's worse than those of us who were not Trump apocalypse predictors thought he would be. Obviously,
Are you moving to Canada?
No, I'm not moving to Canada.
All of the Yale faculty.
no. We really don't know how it's all going to play out. My daughter's in 8th grade, and quite often the entire administration, not often, always, of a previous president gets reduced down to 3 or 4 bullet points that she has to memorize.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting because you could imagine, there's so many things every day. There's this story, there's that story, there's this guy who's deported by mistake. And you don't really, and you wonder, okay, but when it's all said and done and we're 10 years down the line, what will be the bullet points? Because and will those bullet points make it all worthwhile, better than the Kamala Harris bullet points would have been, or with?
I mean, I think so.
Let's speculate what those bullet points would be.
Trump, his first term bullet points would have been pretty good.
Very
right?
good.
Like, where it's like, he brokered the Abraham Accords. He oversaw a growing economy. And
The Trump court got rid of racial preferences.
Yeah, he supercharged, the COVID vaccine production and stuff like that. He doesn't want to admit that, but I don't know. That's a really interesting question.
But that's really the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you get caught up in the hysterics of all of it, and they're valid. I mean, the idea that somebody. Now, I read into it yesterday for the first time, and I realized, oh well, this guy actually might have been. It actually looks like this guy was a gang member, but that really doesn't matter.
It doesn't.
It doesn't matter to the principle of government by shit show.
Right.
And if this guy, if they got lucky enough that this guy actually deserved it, that does not sanitize the procedure as being reckless and a violation of his liberties, even if he's guilty.
Yeah, I mean, and he did have a valid, order where he could not be deported.
Yeah.
So, and people can argue about that. But that's also...
Procedure is everything.
Yeah, and taking a step back, the rhetoric that, we are undergoing a invasion, by MS-13 and by Mexicans and by Indians and by people who want to come here and live here, that's wrong. There isn't a crime wave associated with immigration.
No.
The reason we have more illegal immigration than legal immigration at times is because it's impossible to move here legally. I mean, we
definitely want to get gang members out.
Yeah,
if we
of course,
can do it in
absolutely.
a fair and orderly
and
process.
we want the border to be secured,
Yes.
which Trump and actually Biden in his last 6 months was doing. This is all to the good. And so I'm not apocalyptic about Trump, but this is one of the benefits, and maybe this is also one of the limits of being a libertarian. Like every president, it is this mix of things where it's like, George W. Bush was not completely terrible, but he was terrible on civil liberties. He was terrible on foreign policy. He was terrible on spending, things like that. Obama, not terrible on everything, but he was worse than Bush in a lot of ways. And Trump was worse than Obama in a lot of ways. And Biden was worse than Trump. So it's kind of a perpetual cycle. And I don't think one of the things that bugs me is the idea that, we're not supposed to be critical of the president. This drives me nuts.
Or Anthony Weiner, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You know, well, I don't have to vote for Anthony Weiner.
Oh, you don't have to vote.
And I don't have to. I don't have to live under his, heel.
What about under his boot?
Yeah.
What about even on even on Ukraine? I'm optimistic that the outcome with Trump will be better than it would have been under Harris, which just seemed to be a policy that was just floating in the wind. It had no goal.
Right. I mean, I worry, with Trump and foreign policy, and this is saying a lot because we're coming off of a quarter century of just terrible foreign policy, and I guess he was involved in some of that. It's not clear, people may remember that during the Bush years, it was a big gotcha question. Like, whenever anybody was on a talk show, they'd always be like, well, do you agree with the Bush doctrine? And people would be like, yes, I do. And then well, what is it? And nobody could define it, even though he was like launching major wars in a way.
It was a Charles Krauthammer term, I think, the Bush doctrine.
Yeah, and it was like it wasn't clear. And I can remember reading articles where like, actually, there's 3 Bush doctrines and all of this type of stuff. But it's good to have basic principles that are thought through, that are debated, articulated, and then actually govern how we do things. And, I don't think we had that under Bush. We definitely didn't have it under Obama, who appeared, who didn't run as an anti-war candidate, but was perceived as such and did nothing to, change that thinking. And then he was kind of a warmonger when he was in office. And then Trump, it's not clear, what is his governing principles, because there's something sickening when he's telling a country that was invaded, that you are the problem, and that if you don't kiss my ass right now, like I'm going to say, go straight ahead, Putin, and go in. Having said that, and then his position on Israel is different, and it's kind of obscure. But what is Trump's set of basic coordinates that he uses to determine foreign policy? It's not clear.
Do you find that?
But just to agree with you, I mean, it's better. I think it's better than Biden. Where whatever Biden was doing, he was spending a lot, but then also telling people you could do this, but not this, and like he was simultaneously, giving a lot of money and micromanaging, or being kind of vacant. So
and I mean, bogged down it, but obviously there were certain kind of optimism early on in the war that they might just do this, and maybe the Prigozhin is going to get rid of Putin, and maybe he has pancreatic cancer. So there was reasons, but I don't think anybody thinks that Ukraine is going to expel Russia from the Donbass anymore. And if that's the case, then time may be on Russia's side. Like if they dick around for another 2 years, Russia might roll into Kiev.
Right.
So. And it was, I think we all breathed a sigh of relief to hear Trump actually say out loud that he was pissed off at Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
And so that we hope you try to divine where Trump's coming from. I'm much, much more off-put and scared of J.D. Vance and this post-Trump MAGA motley crew of nuts. I see them as nuts, people who praise Alex Jones and whatever it is. And, Trump's 78 years old. It's not like crazy to think Vance could be president even in this term. Yeah. How do you feel about this guy?
It's this. You had mentioned earlier on that you don't like Elon Musk, right?
I have a better opinion of Musk than I do of Vance.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say that what's interesting, and I think the Doge project is a good idea, and I don't like the way it's being executed. And my colleague Matt Welch has talked about this in other contexts of when something gets going, like you don't have the ability to try a bunch of different things to see what works, like in terms of cutting government or whatever. Like
trial and error.
The moment happens, and then like if your first cut is probably going to be what you get, like your first take. And I think they're doing it wrong in a way that's going to discredit the idea of like cutting government for a long time, and that bothers me a lot. But on another level, within Trump world, Elon Musk does, he earlier, or I guess late last year and earlier this year, he was talking about being in favor of high wage or high skilled immigration, and that he would fight the MAGA people, including J.D. Vance, on that.
And Bannon,
And it worries me because everybody, there's a flurry of stories, and I suspect there's some truth to it that he's going to be leaving the White House, or the sphere of influence pretty soon. And if Trump becomes fully just MAGA all the way, and there is no kind of people on there who are saying, what, maybe we need to be more economically minded, maybe we need to be thinking about immigration and other, pulling back from the strict MAGA world. I think that's very disturbing.
Scares the shit out of me. I mean, by the way, Trump has always been for these H-1B visas. This is a issue that he championed in 2015. I remember hearing him arguing with Bannon about it. And one thing about Trump,
mix. Yeah.
He doesn't change his positions that easily, he's so I think he'll stick by it. But this maybe is one of the last things we'll talk about, the new respect that all these conspiracy theorists have in that world, that Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones and whoever else there is,
Owens
seem to have the president's ear,
and
they have Vance's ear,
Yeah.
And then Kash Patel and all these various knucklehead appointees, Matt Gaetz, who didn't.
They got to be pissed.
Now you might be a
now.
fan of Tulsi Gabbard. I don't know because I know you have you share some of her politics.
Yeah, no,
But to me, she's a flake. Even if I agree with her on some things,
Yeah, I mean it's odd because she. Everybody's a critic of the deep state, and then when you start running it, you start to find reasons to keep it or to do certain things and all that. But I share your concerns about a lot of this stuff because the conspiracy theory world, and there's a left-wing version of it, but it's not in power right now. It's disturbing because I don't know, and I don't know how you engage.
It mixes with Ukraine because, all right, Trump, seems to want to impose a settlement kind of in a common sense way, where Vance hates Zelensky.
Yeah.
He hates him like the guy's done something wrong.
Yeah.
Like the guy's never done anything wrong. He was invaded, right?
Yeah.
And then if you look at his ideological cousins, they clearly hate Vance because he's Jewish.
Zelensky.
Zelensky because he's Jewish. They come out and say it.
And then there's the classic trope of where Zelensky's Jewish and he's really a Nazi.
Yes.
Because
he's a Bolshevik, they call him.
That's right.
And that Tucker Carlson will, talk about him rat-like and sweaty, and then Glenn Greenwald they'll talk about how our support for Ukraine is really about Israel. So this is all very ominous to me. I kind of trust Trump on this stuff. Why in the world do they hate Zelensky like this? It's psychotic.
Yeah,
they hate him.
I don't know. I don't.
How could he have
that.
pleased
and
them
again,
by just rolling over and let the Russians in?
Yeah, and this is the whole thing too. Is that it's one thing to be against America, giving aid, much less troops or anything, to Ukraine.
That's on us, not on Zelensky.
Yeah, and I mean he's asking for help and things like that, and I think he's made mistakes and all of that, but it's a very strange position where you're basically arguing, that this guy who really rose to the occasion. I mean, I'm regardless of ideology in a lot of ways, because Yeltsin was like this too, where he rose to his moment in history and then couldn't sustain it, and that we have reverberations of that. But it's kind of amazing, and when Zelensky, what is he the equivalent? George Lopez, or something? Like a sitcom comedian. Jerry Seinfeld. Becoming like a meaningful leader. It's very strange.
What was that Russian comic's name?
Oh, Yakov Smirnoff. Yeah, who has a very good podcast now.
Does he?
Yeah. And he, I don't know if he's still there or if he does it from there, but he moved to Branson, Missouri.
Wow.
And had a regular show there.
He's very patriotic American, right?
Yeah. Reason Foundation, the nonprofit that publishes the magazine, actually gave him an award sometime in like the 80s or very early 90s. And that is I don't know where he is on, the Ukraine, Russia split, because you never know, when people who left the Soviet Union, they have odd allegiances.
Now, before we go, because I'm always feuding with Dave Smith, who is supposedly a libertarian.
Yeah.
Can you explain the split between the Gillespie wing and the Smith wing of the libertarian movement?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because I agree with
Yeah.
you guys so much, and I think everything they say is out to lunch.
Yeah, it's there. It without going into details too much. Part of it is the difference between somebody like Friedrich Hayek as a thinker or an organizing principle and Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard is a very influential at the groups that Dave, is particularly at home with, like the Mises Institute. Rothbard was an anarcho-capitalist, and he, through a lot of complicated kind of thinking about stuff, he's an anarcho-capitalist, but then ended up rolling for a time with David Duke, or being very interested in the kind of populist right in the years ago, and then Rothbard's been dead for a while, but his followers are kind of interested in that, and that immigration is somehow we shouldn't have any government, but we should have like a really strict border until all property is privately owned.
So, but
And there's, to put it more bluntly, and I don't mean this pejoratively, like I mean this descriptively, but I think part of it is also it's dispositional, and a lot of libertarians are. I hate to use the word cosmopolitan because that gets used as an invective against me, but some people like living in kind of sloppy, heterodox places where all sorts of weird shit and weird people happen, right? And and then some people don't. Some people like living in more hierarchical and more monocultural places, and that could be ethnically, it could be class, it could be all sorts of things, or people who believe the same thing, and that's a big split in the broad libertarian movement.
okay, but so just like if you're about liberty, and liberty is what moves you, your heart is swells to the sultry strains of liberty, whatever.
Okay.
It is. Then Ukraine, you would think, would be something that you would support. Here is a country about to be overrun by a tyrannical dictator, and they're fighting for their freedom. They may not be a perfect democracy, but certainly their future is brighter under Ukrainian government than it is going to be. So, but their instinct is vehemently in the other direction. I mean, what's going on here? Is this, why would a libertarian movement ever speak this way about a people fighting for their freedom?
Yeah, I don't understand that, and again, I'm not committed to American troops being in Ukraine, and I think we need a good accounting of all the aid that we give, and in general, I'm against foreign aid. But yeah, when you look at the optics of the picture, where there's a David and a Goliath, you would think that most libertarians are always going to be on the side of the David, and that matters. And it's also, this Tucker Carlson went through a libertarian phase. I mean, he was an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute in D.C. Shortly before he formed the Daily Caller. And I have an old, I used to do a Reason talk show with Michael Moynihan when he worked at Reason. And we had an episode where Tucker was on, and he was talking in ways it's like you would not recognize the same person, because he was, anti-government, and he was, he was very libertarian. And, to see him going to Russia and doing a kind of, reverse minstrel show of Paul Robeson, or like, a black leftist in Stalin's Moscow, and talking about how great the supermarkets are and the subways and all of that. It's very peculiar. And I think some of it is, and again, I don't know that this is, particularly libertarian, but there's, some people like tradition and hierarchy and like clarity in social relations. A man is a man and a woman is a woman, and we don't, and gays are problematic because they don't, they don't fit into categories and things like that. And then other people are like, whatever, do whatever you want, and as long as you're not hurting somebody.
And they have this urge. Now, of course, it's always very, very hard. It's the unanswerable question in a certain way, how to the trade-off between actual lives dying and that it was worth it for those lives to be lost in order to fight for a certain way of life.
Yeah.
Is it better to have them be slaves, or is it better to support the war where 30,000 innocent people will die, but will end slavery? These are, very, very tough questions, right? But you would think that the libertarians somehow would have a tougher time with that question because they value liberty. And then, of course, there seems to be. See, I don't see the libertarianism at all in what they're saying. And then just my pet peeve is if this notion that, let's say you accept all their arguments that Putin was provoked, by whatever nonsense there is, an offhand comment by Baker before, whatever it is. So, and to the extent that you think that his the non-pretextual part of his concerns about whatever's going on in Ukraine and provocations from ethnic Russians, whatever it is. So he was provoked, and therefore he had no choice but to go into Ukraine, and now he should be entitled to keep 20% of the country. Okay, fine. So that's your kind of principles. Okay. Now let's take those principles and use them to examine another chapter. Let's look at the 1967 situation that Israel was in. Egypt puts 100,000 troops on the borders, removes the UN peacekeepers, has a blockade, has genocidal rhetoric. Israel is provoked. They take out the Egyptian army. They didn't. And then Jordan attacks. That's more than provoked. And they take this land. These same people say, no, not 1 square inch should Israel be able to keep. Not 1 inch. I don't care if you were provoked. Or they'll say, you weren't provoked. You had a choice. They'll say, of course they had a choice. They had less of a choice than Putin did. Right? So unless there's something I'm missing or I'm being unfair, which I don't like to be, I'm calling bullshit on the whole point of view.
Well,
and I'm yet to hear someone push back on me and say, this is what you're missing, Noam.
Well, I'm not, my libertarianism, I think, is pretty open and forthright.
Yeah.
So I
stand for what I stand for. You want to, and I mean, I said in a conversation with the people we're going to have dinner with us, everybody's entitled to due process, even if, in my opinion, even if it's not a constitutional requirement. It's basic fairness and morality that people should be treated fairly when they can be. People should not suffer consequences without some procedure that allows them to state their case. Like, I don't have to give my employees due process. I can say to my employee, you know what? I think you were stealing. You're out. But I don't do that. I say, listen, I think you were stealing. What do you have to say for yourself? Well, listen to here. Here's a witness. I embark at that because it's so these immigrants. He doesn't deserve due process. He's here illegally.
It's much worse too. I mean, business owners are one thing, but when it's the government, they have
of course,
ostensibly a monopoly on force, so they're held to a higher standard. Because you can fire somebody that can get a job somewhere else if you're running the government and you put somebody away or do the same thing.
I don't think businesses should have the requirement. I'm saying, but when it's not too onerous a burden on me, I will reserve the right to say, listen, I don't trust it. You got to go.
Well,
But this is where the libertarian point of view in general really moves me because it's a respect for people and for fairness and for freedom in a way.
Well, I think
wherever you can find it.
One of the kind of paradoxes of the current moment, or of the certainly of the past 25 years, I'm really starting to see the 21st century. Like, it's worth talking about it because a lot of negative trends accelerated. Some positive things accelerated during it. But, this concept that we've lost so much trust and confidence in government. And I think we've done that rightly because government has acted poorly. In the first Gulf, or not the first Gulf War, in the Iraq War, and throughout the war on terror, our government just lied to us. They lied about what they were doing, and they also lied about how much it cost and how they were spending money. They lied about the financial crisis, the causes of it, and the remedies to it. They lied about COVID in all sorts of ways and made a lot of we have every reason to have less trust and confidence in government. And from a libertarian perspective, superficially, that's like a good thing because once people don't trust the government, they're going to say we want less of it. But that isn't the way it works. And ironically, and I wrote a story about this a few years ago in Reason, which was semi-controversial within libertarian circles, whereas saying, we've won that idea, that argument of the idea that you shouldn't trust the government because it is incompetent at best and kind of malevolent at worst. But that doesn't lead to less government. It actually leads predictably around the world to people wanting more like a strong man or strong governments that can, stop the chaos. And I feel like this is what's happening under Trump. He came in and he said, I'm going to destroy the deep state. I'm going to get rid of all of, these administrative bureaucrats who are just doing whatever they want without any restraint. And he's modeling that now in a lot of ways. And so, it isn't going, you're not going to change direction by doing more and better of what you're combating. And ironically, I think, libertarians would do well. And this, I'm in a minority position in the libertarian movement because I'm not an anarchist in this sense. But like, we need to, show where government legitimately has an interest and how it can be effective and efficient. And I actually think once people understand that can happen, they will vote, they'll vote for less government. This happened in the 90s, throughout the 90s at the state and federal level, as the government started doing less things and it did them more effectively, the burden of government shifted. So, we have a lot of work to do. And
Trump is a shame, right? Because he came into office now and he's got such a cult-like power that he could have literally chosen, any subtle direction to go in, and the country would have come along.
It also remains to be seen. You're right that he is remarkably consistent in many of his beliefs. I mean, he changes them because, like, when he first ran, he was anti-Bitcoin. And now he's kind of like pro-Bitcoin and certainly crypto, et cetera.
Yeah, those are not his deeply held beliefs.
But you're right that he's pretty predictable. But the other thing to remember, it's weird because this is his second term, so he's kind of a lame duck already. But then, as he approaches the midterms, he's going to be very lame duck. But I was going to say, when you look at somebody like Ronald Reagan, at this point in his first term, he was a complete disaster. Like, he got what he wanted, and things went really poorly. And then by 1984, he was about to win 49 states and probably 50. I think they gave him, they gave Walter Mondale Minnesota to so he wasn't completely humiliated. But so things can change pretty quickly, and Trump is probably adaptable. And like as the tariffs go into place and if the economy tanks, he can't live with that.
No.
And he'll start to change things.
I agree with you. He more than anything, he wants to be popular. Mm-hmm. And actually, I think he wants the country to do well.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I don't, people have this horrible impression of the guy. I think he's more complicated than that, but I don't think he has.
And it's not, I mean, I think Biden, to the extent that he had anything going on at the end, like he didn't want to leave office being a bum, right? And it's an interesting point. I hope somebody close to Trump is saying, like, what are the 3 bullet points you want people to remember? And it's not going to be, I deported a bunch of, guys who hung out at Home Depot parking lots. Like, it's going to be that,
I should have put it. They all want the country to do well. But I think the country, a picture of a country doing well, according to Donald Trump, in many ways would be closer to what you and I would think of than what Joe Biden. Who knows what a left-wing Democratic vision of the country doing well is. It's certainly not, I don't even know if business even occurs to them. Or press even occurs, free speech occurs to them.
Yeah, I mean, Trump on free speech is really incredibly bad. And he had an executive order that was great where he basically said, this Biden era jawboning of social media and actually leaning on people, that's done, which is good. But then he's, going after people for all sorts of things. And he has an FCC chief, who is, going after networks and programs for the way they edit videos. And, this is insanity. I mean, it's like
the way they edit videos about him.
Yeah.
In an ironic, listen, the guy is so thin-skinned and he makes a fool of himself.
Yeah.
But I don't see any anti-free speech movement coming out of his movement. They're the free speech people. even if he's a disgraceful guy. And I don't like the way they're going after the university. I'm sure we agree.
Yeah, and it's one thing
let
to
the
cut
people protest for Hamas.
Yeah, it's one thing to cut, money, and it's one thing to cut, even funding for research, because there are ways around that. But to, be going after people because of the things they say, that's, profoundly un-American. I hope that Donald Trump
judges will be much more free, good stories.
Is it for what they're saying, or are they falling under things like inciting violence or harassing people?
I don't know. It's
I don't trust anything they say.
Yeah, and the idea.
Well, it's not what they're saying. It's what
I don't trust anything the Trump administration is saying.
Yeah, and,
sure.
Students I don't think writing editorials in a student newspaper is an incitement to violence.
No,
We gotta go. This is the problem.
Okay, well,
it's just like the pardons. I'm totally persuadable about almost anything. Be a professional, write a document, present it to the American people. This guy is pardoned for this, and this reason. This person is being deported. He did this, and that. Have it ready to present to the people at the time you're deporting them. Sure, it's not like I'm.
Yeah.
But they don't do that.
Yeah.
They put the cart before the horse. They throw them out.
Can I, in a way, hopefully this will be the legacy of Donald Trump, is that he will have made him, if he makes America more like New York, I think that would be a good thing, because what's great about New York, everybody disagrees, and, there's a ton of different types of people living different kinds of lives here, and it all kind of works. And to me, that's my vision of America. It is, it is like it is the Lower East Side. It is Greenwich Village. It's Hell's Kitchen, and it's just people doing what they want to do to make their lives interesting and express themselves and make money. And in a way, you're right. I think Trump understands that kind of on a cellular level, even if he doesn't know how to articulate it, and often works against that. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the people around him don't share that. They're very uncomfortable with that kind of thriving hub of, just weirdness, of individualism and weirdness. And I hate the people that worries me.
All right, we got to go. Are you coming to take a cab with me?
I guess I have to.
You don't have to.
Maybe I'll walk.
Thank you very much, as always. Nick Gillespie, Reason Magazine, free minds and free markets and free everything. Bye, everybody. Free sex.
Free mumia.